Mr. Clarke, it is an honor and a pleasure to have you here at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for your excellent lecture, and in particular the engaging discussion that we just had. We'd like to ask you a few follow-up questions, in particular about cultural diplomacy, but also other related issues. First question I'd like to pose. You were a senior cabinet member of the Blair government and a member of Parliament until 2010. Very well known around the world, especially in the United Kingdom. What are your future political plans and your plans in general? Secondly, during your tenure as Home Secretary, can you tell us how much the government was involved in promoting intercultural dialogue in the UK and worldwide? And thirdly, from your experience, do you think that cultural diplomacy, if well developed and researched, could be a viable tool to promote intercultural dialogue between the public?
I'm now doing a whole range of things. I was defeated in the election in May 2010, so since then I've not been a member of Parliament, and I'm doing some academic work, some work on international education and some work on migration, which I see as a key question which needs to be properly addressed. One of the bits of work I'm doing academically relates directly to cultural diplomacy, which is I've been chairing a set of debates in London called the Westminster Faith Debates, which are the results of work on religion and society research programme, which has been going for 5 years, about the place of religion in society today, which is of itself an interesting sub-part of the discussion which you had. At the Home Office, we tried to promote some cultural diplomacy, some discussion, principally after 7/7, the bomb attacks in London at that time, which was a problem because it's something which is necessary at all times, not simply in responding to a particular event. But there were some quite useful discussions, which I think are still going forward in a reasonably positive way. The core point about cultural diplomacy is the need for different groups of people, whether religions, faiths, political groups, ethnic groups, to understand others and to understand what they're trying to achieve and what they're preoccupied with. For me, the number one word is respect. There was a British Olympic athlete called Linford Christie, who was a great 100-metre world champion, and he had an organisation for him called Enough Respect, and he was trying to promote the idea of respect, in particular the long battle for any kind of coherent community cohesion in Britain was based on the argument that everybody deserved respect. And I think that's a large part of what cultural diplomacy is about. It's about respecting other peoples individually, other people's cultures. But I think there's another dimension too, which is very important, which for me is summed up in a book by Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, who wrote a book called Identity and Violence. And what he said was each of us have within us a whole series of different forms of identity, being a man, being British, being white, and so on, being a Norwich City supporter for my sins, and so on. And I have the right to decide which of those identities I promote in my own life and take forward in my own life. And I have the right for individuals outside not to say, you're just a Norwich City supporter, or whatever. And I think that's a very important belief, and it has big implications for cultural diplomacy, because if you stop classifying people just as being a woman, a black woman, a white man, or whatever, but say actually every individual has a whole set of identities which they choose for themselves in the way that they want to express themselves, then that has implications for cultural diplomacy, I think, and is the way I think we should be looking at the world much more in these days.
Okay. Now, you just made reference to the domestic situation in the UK. What if we take it to the international level in terms of what place does cultural diplomacy have in British foreign policy? Is the British Council enough, or should there be more in cultural diplomacy when it comes to engaging other countries?
There should always be more. The British Council has a long and honourable tradition of playing a particular role, as similar organisations like the Goethe Institute have in other countries. Here we are in Berlin, the Goethe Institute's played a major role. I'm a great believer in George or not war. I believe the credit for the end of the Cold War in 1989 here in this city goes much more to Willy Brandt and Mikhail Gorbachev than it does to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. There's a general view that because the West was big armed up, as it were, that the Soviet Union conceded and rolled over. I don't think that was the case. I think the policies of Helsinki, of détente, of rapprochement generally, laid the foundation for this fundamental change in a relatively peaceful way. And that's my view of issues throughout the world today. Now, I think Britain doesn't do enough of it, though in fairness to Britain, Britain does more than most.
Well, thank you very much. I think my colleague would like to ask you a question as well.
Okay, so as we see it from here, from Germany, the UK position on the EU is somehow not so clear, as it is very much affected by US-UK relations, the Commonwealth and other historical reasons. I would therefore like to ask you several questions on this theme. What is your current position of you and your party with regards to the crisis in Greece? And what is your suggestion to the new Greek government? We'll start with that.
Firstly, in general, I don't think it's just the US, UK and the Commonwealth relations. That was true, I'd say, some time ago, but I don't think it's that now. You've got a very political view by the current British government, which I don't agree with, that is not in favour of working closely with the European Union. I think we should work closely with the European Union. I think that should be the core of our foreign policy. And within the Labour government, I was very prominent in arguing for a stronger pro-European position. On the Greek position, I think that the restrictions, the deficit reduction strategy is too tight. And I think with the election of the New Democracy-led government, and I'm delighted that PASOK, which is the party which is in partnership with the British Labour Party, has gone into the coalition in Greece, I think that the best situation there is to honour the agreements, which is what the new government is trying to do. But also I think the rest of the EU, in particular the Germans, ought to also ease up a bit. I think the changes which are being asked in the Greek society are so dramatic and so fast and create so many deep social tensions that I think it's important to have a process of positive change. And I think that the fact that the Greek people elected this government rather than an alternative government, which was a close-run thing, is a statement by the Greek people that they want to stay in the euro, they want to stay in the eurozone. They acknowledge that there are things they have to do to make that happen, but please make it slightly easier than is the case at the moment. And I think that's the approach that the rest of the European Union should take.
Okay, do you believe that there is a chance that the UK will leave the EU? What would be the conditions and ramifications of this?
It would be nothing less than a total unmitigated disaster. I don't exclude it. I don't think it's at all likely. I think the relationship between the UK and the EU has become so damaged that it's difficult to conduct a mature discussion now. And you now have the position of our Prime Minister in the ludicrous position of telling the other European countries what to do in the Eurozone, but at the same time saying he wants nothing to do with it. Of course, those of us who argued that Britain should join the Euro in the late 1990s, one of our core arguments was that at times of crisis we should be a voice at the table, able to influence the process and carry it through, which through our non-membership of the Eurozone we're not, and we should refrain from sending unhelpful remarks into the situation, in my view. I think that so much of our trade, so much of our culture, so much of our history is bound up in the European relationship, that if we were in fact to leave the EU, it would be a total disaster. And I don't believe it'll happen. Even if there's a referendum on it in Britain, I believe the British people would vote to stay in the Euro.
So my question...
Eurozone, I beg your pardon. I said Euro, I should have said Eurozone.
My questions relate to the UK media scandal and the Leveson inquiry. What is your position on this development? And secondly, what measures are the Labour Party taking to avoid a future repeat, because they are embroiled in the fiascos that have happened? And secondly, what is your position on the involvement of Mr. Gordon Brown and Mr. Murdoch?
Well, I, as somebody who was pursued by News International, has given evidence to the police on that matter, I hope they're brought to justice and brought to court. They're absolutely fundamental issues about the relationship between politics and the media. I don't think it's about dinner parties with Rupert Murdoch or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's part of life, and I think it's a good part of life, actually. I think people should have dialogue and talk rather than not. It's a question of what you actually do following those situations. Gordon, a good friend of mine, made some remarks at the Leveson inquiry which I thought were ill-judged. But generally speaking, I think that there has to be reform so that the media doesn't behave in the unacceptable way in which it has been behaving. Whether Leveson will emerge with that is an open question. I don't know. My own personal solution is that there is a code of conduct which exists right now, which is not a bad code, which eliminates certain kinds of activity, for example, covering the children of celebrities and so on. And that should be enforced. And if necessary, that should be enforced by making it statutory. But I'm not in favour of going further than that.
Thank you.
And the final question, obviously at the ITD, we're very committed to open discussion. But what's your opinion with regard to the case of Mr. Julian Assange?
I have contempt for him. I think that's the best thing I can say. I think that a man like him, who behaves in a way which threatens people's lives, and then is not prepared to face up to charges against him on very unpleasant sex offence charges, and God save us, is in the Ecuador embassy at the moment trying to escape justice, I think is absolutely execrable. He's a man for whom I have no regard whatsoever. Not least because he says he wants complete openness of others, but is not prepared to give complete openness himself as to what he does. The fact is that complete openness is a qualified thing. People need, at official level and at personal level, the right to have private conversations. I've favoured and voted for legislation to open up government, for example, the Freedom of Information Act, which has changed our government a great deal. But there still are constraints, and people are entitled to have conversations in private about what they think about affairs of the day, without it being in the newspapers at every time. The danger of the Assange approach, the pernicious danger of the Assange approach, is that it prevents anybody talking to each other at all. You started your question rightly by celebrating the virtues of open conversation. People will not talk openly if every remark they make is going to be in the newspapers every time, and so on. And it's critically important. We discussed just now the situation in Syria. You can't possibly move to a more sensible solution for Syria without it being possible for serious conversations to take place in an open way between parties to the discussion in Syria, which are not broadcast on the media the second that you do it. And I think that's actually obvious. Julian Assange is both hypocritical and dishonest in the way he's approached it, and I think he should stand trial in Sweden for the issues upon which he has been charged.
Mr. Clarke, thank you very, very much. You've been generous with your time in a number of ways, and I think the interview is also a wonderful expansion on some of the themes we discussed earlier this morning. Thank you very much for coming to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
An honor to meet you. Thank you.